Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And you can find archive footage of these programs online at youtube.com and then search Freedom and Prosperity Radio there. Of course, find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. Join our Tuesday morning group coalitions. You can tune in virtually or be there in person the first Tuesday of each month in Richmond. Joining us next, I think, is an important adjunct to our conversation about the issues facing Congress from the previous section is Phil Kerpen from American Commitment. Phil Kerpen, welcome back to the program. I appreciate your visit, as always, and all of your visits to the program. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent. AmericanCommitment.org is Phil's website. And we were just talking about kind of the dysfunction in the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate that manifests in a lot of ways. The only way they can appear to do anything is to spend more. It seems to be the only thing they can agree on is to spend more. And the conversation has been dominated by accusations of what each side wants to cut, demagoguing issues like defense or Social Security programs. Phil, talk about spending reform. You've written a great piece at AmericanCommitment.org about that. Where should the real answers be found?
Well, if it were easy, it would have been done by now. So it's not easy, and I don't have a simple answer to your question. But we've got to do something to address out-of-control federal spending because even with revenues running much higher than the historical norm. In fact, last year we had the second highest revenue year in history as a percent of GDP. We've got very large deficits. Spending is really out of line. And some of that is the extra $6 trillion that was spent in the name of COVID relief, although a lot of that was one-time spending and has sort of come down. The bigger problem that we've got in the immediate term is that interest rates are rising, and so the cost of financing federal debt and deficits is rising, and that's starting to squeeze out other things. And of course, every area of federal spending has just risen substantially. And then the long-term problem, of course, is the entitlement programs, but there's no political appetite to do anything about those. And so the question, I think, for the spending debate we're going to have this year as we go into a budget process, and then ultimately we'll probably have two flashpoints, one over the debt ceiling and another as appropriations get resolved. Mm-hmm. The question, I think, is, are Republicans willing to, number one, put real cuts on the table, and number two, to defend them and to take it to the mat and to fight against the Senate and the president to see some of these things through. And, they've put some ideas out there, relatively low-hanging fruit, like canceling some of the unobligated COVID funds that are still sitting in the Treasury, bringing work requirements to food stamps, canceling, making students pay their student loans again, canceling the giveaways that Biden is attempting in that area. These sorts of things can add up. If you look at what the House Budget Committee put out, it adds up to about $750 billion over 10 years. I'm more a fan of the proposed budget that Russ Vought put out, the former Trump budget director. He's identified $11 trillion in cuts. And, ultimately, this is going to have to be negotiated between the Speaker and the President. And the President kind of says he doesn't want to cut anything ever. The problem is if we keep doing that and we just accumulate more and more debt, we're going to have a debt crisis at some point, not the sort of the political one where you're debating a debt ceiling, but a real one where the size of the debt itself is so large that you can't manage it.
And that creates the fiscal concern that it's all sort of fun and games. You and I have talked about this before, Phil. I'm sure I've talked about it with pretty much everyone. It's a real drag on cocktail parties when I start bringing up reserve currency. But at some point, the world is going to say, yeah, Bretton Woods was nice, but maybe we need a different reserve currency.
Well, if the federal government's finances are as bad as they're projected to be. And the Treasury put out a report last year that has debt as a percent of GDP rising from about 100% now to 700% at the end of this century. Now, I don't like to predict anything 80 years out, so I mean, take it with a whole shaker of salt. But the point is, that's the long-term trajectory that we're on. At some point, the rest of the world may think that there's a better store of value in something else, some other currency or some basket of currencies or a commodity or what have you. Nothing lasts forever. As much as the current institutional arrangements have been stable for a long time, it's not. There's no guarantee that the world has to remain holding dollars if U.S. finances deteriorate. Something else might make more sense. And, obviously if that happens, then our ability to print our way out of this mess, it becomes much more difficult.
Well, and that, I guess, becomes the issue is whether or not we're actually running into a position where our dollar becomes less valuable than many of the other currencies. I guess right now we're lucky because the yuan in China has been manipulated to a point where most people still don't trust that.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is we had this huge pulse of inflation over the last couple of years with all of the COVID spending, most of which was financed by Federal Reserve money printing. But the dollar strengthened over that period because the rest of the world's condition deteriorated even more than ours did for the most part. And so sometimes you can be kind of the cleanest, dirty shirt in the hamper and continue to remain attractive. But I would not count on that as a strategy.
So you were talking about the vote strategy of $11 trillion in cuts. I know I've seen budget proposals that point to just redundancies in programs that are redundant in general, whether or not even debated whether they're necessary or not. They're just redundant to other programs. Are some of these places where you can kind of get started and then see if it does have the impact you hope it does?
Well, I think there are a lot of federal programs that are probably cause more harm than good and can be eliminated. The other thing that's really interesting about where we are right now is, we're 3 years into most federal workers being remote most of the time, and you got to wonder if you really need them all. And how much are they really working, and how much do we really need them if they can go years without going into the office? And so I think there may be opportunities to eliminate whole programs, substantially cut headcount in other areas, and that kind of thing. One of the interesting features of the labor market right now is that there's a labor shortage in a lot of sectors. And so, if you can move people from the public sector to the private sector without the upheaval of a lot of people being out of work, that could be a unique opportunity of the situation that we're in right now. But, my view is, I would love to get rid of whole cabinet departments and aggressively close programs and so forth. And I do think there's a potential opportunity to do that. But also, realistically, there's almost you could probably cut 10 or 20% from most budget lines in the federal budget because just the amount of waste and duplication and inefficiency that goes on across the entire federal government. I also think that we could cut defense. And, a lot of Republicans say, you can never cut defense. We need to defend the country. And it's like, okay, but there's like $50 billion of green energy stuff in the defense fund.
Yeah.
I mean, when Biden sent out those COVID tests in the mail, that was a defense procurement. I mean, there's stuff that has nothing to do with defending the country that we're spending out of the Pentagon. And so, I mean, I think you could find cuts almost anywhere if you wanted to. The challenge, of course, is that we're dealing with a president and a Senate that's controlled by Democrats who don't want to cut anything, and so Republicans are going to have to be pretty strategic about this and make sure that to the extent that some of these negotiations have to be done in public, that they lead with things that they can, that the public will agree with them on, and that's I think going to be the key. Ultimately, I think we're actually in an improved situation right now to actually get some spending cuts this year. The president has already moved from "I won't negotiate" to having begun negotiations. And I've seen a bunch of polls now, and they pretty much all agree that if the government's going to take on more debt, they've got to have a plan to reduce spending. They can't just change nothing and add to the debt, which is the Democratic position. And so Republicans actually have the political high ground if they can take advantage of it.
When you look at the spending, especially through all of these executive branch bureaucracies, and we were just talking a little bit about West Virginia versus EPA, and how Congress has grown fancied to just writing a very vague bill. We want the Chesapeake Bay cleaned up, and then the EPA has a blank check to do that. Is that another place we could rein in some of this stuff rather than just having platitudes leading to regulations?
Well, I think that the regulatory agencies are one of the best places to cut, because in the regulatory agencies you have a big economic bang for the buck. And there's a study, it was probably 10 years ago now, I don't know if they've updated it, but there was a study maybe about 8 or 10 years ago by a think tank called the Phoenix Center. And they actually they did an econometric analysis, and they looked at the impact of federal employment in the federal regulatory agencies. And, they had EPA on there, but, they had they looked across all of the federal regulatory agencies, and they found a direct relationship between the headcount, the number of employees of the regulatory agencies, and the costs that were imposed on the private sector. And they found that for each employee in a federal regulatory agency, they destroyed on average 98 private sector jobs. And so if you can cut the headcount of the regulatory agencies and cut the budgets of the regulatory agencies so that they're less aggressive, so they're in a resource-constrained environment and they're focusing on the things that they really have to do instead of the things that they want to do ideologically, sort of the regulatory adventurism, you can have significant benefit in terms of growth in the private economy as a consequence of that. And so I don't think you're going to get huge budget savings necessarily from the regulatory agencies, because they're such a minuscule piece of the overall federal budget, but you can get very large economic benefits from cutting the regulatory agencies. And those economic benefits, of course, improve the budget outlook as well, because you get a bigger economy, which means more revenue. And so part of the approach to sort of cutting spending and improving the federal government should be growing the denominator, growing the economy. And that's, I think, where regulatory reforms and slimming down some of the regulatory agencies and trimming them in so they're not so aggressive in regulating the private economy, that can have big benefits, not as much on reducing the amount of government spending because they're so small as from a budgetary standpoint, but big impact in terms of growing the economy, and that has a significant impact on the budget outlook, not just on the revenue side, but also for the entitlement programs. If you have a bigger economy, you got more money going into those also. And so I do think that that's a very important part of the agenda, regulatory reform and oversight, as well as through the budget process of the regulatory agencies.
Well, if you can get the courage, it seems to me that in Virginia we're sort of painting that picture on a smaller scale, but it's been so long, I don't think anyone's ever painted the picture for a lot of the 30-somethings and under that we've cut taxes, even to the minimal degree Governor Youngkin wanted to, and collections at the state level went up even more. So I think you have that, as you say, grow the denominator, and then if you can cut the taxes and the regulatory burden and some of the spending, it will wind up being a plus on both sides. Even if it's not as much of a cut in spending as you could do, it winds up catching up. I looked at your chart in the column you wrote. More debt without spending restraints, and I look at the outlays and revenues, and it's weird how all of a sudden this last 5 or 6 years. Outlays and revenues have tracked, in conjunction with one another, when prior to that they worked inversely.
Well, we had we had some unusual circumstances the last few years. We had the Trump tax cuts, which really revved up economic growth, and we got a big feedback effect, especially on the corporate side. We got record corporate revenues, although I think they're going to come in much lower this year. And then, of course, we had the explosion of COVID spending, and some of that was recycled in revenues also. And so I don't know that, the extraordinary circumstances of the last couple of years mean that anything has fundamentally changed going forward. But it certainly has, probably permanently raised the inflation outlook because of the way so much of that spending was, financed by, Fed Treasury purchases.
Is there politically, where we look at, where these politicians, they can do one thing, they can count. Is there a place where the folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and folks who talk about the right to a dwelling, a right to a guaranteed income, the right to medical care, that can, if that metastasizes, we really are in a whole different world, and all of this discussion becomes academic?
Well, I mean, you look, that rights language is very dangerous because when you start calling things rights, government takes over the financing of them, and they get wildly more expensive and more bureaucratic and more corrupt in various ways. And you look at the two things that have had the most government involvement and the most government subsidy, which are education and healthcare, and they're by far the most expensive sectors, and they've risen the fastest in terms of price. And I would argue we've got pretty limited quality in return for that versus the things where there's very little government involvement and lots of competition, and especially trade-sensitive sectors, prices have plunged. You look at things like cell phones and TVs and stuff like that. So I think when someone says, we're going to make housing a right and guarantee it to everyone, to me that means you're going to quintuple rents and have taxpayers pay for it, basically, and it's going to be another boondoggle like education and healthcare. We should be trying to figure out how to get well-functioning markets and reduce government subsidy in the areas that government has taken a huge footprint in, instead of adding more areas, kind of to it's a right, government's going to handle it purview.
Well, and that's the brinksmanship. I think, my party smells better than your party rhetoric in Washington has led us to, what inflation? There's no inflation kind of argument that's, hitting the American coffee table. I couldn't care less which political party admits it. Just do something about it, right, Phil?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Something that can't go on forever won't. And so, we're not going to get to 700% of GDP in federal debt at the end of the century like Treasury predicts. Something's going to happen before that. Either we're going to adjust course and they're going to come to some sort of an agreement and change the trajectory, or we're going to have a meltdown and an acute debt crisis, and we're not going to be able to finance the bonds, and the rest of the world's going to lose confidence in the dollar. And, look, if we don't deal with our problems, we're going to be forced to, and it's going to be in a chaotic fashion, and the outcome's going to be worse. And so you just hope that there are enough serious people to do something to head this off before we get to that point.
Is there a danger in that chaos, that there are people who covet the chaos because somebody once said we need to fundamentally change the United States and how it operates?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's possible. Look, generally speaking, crises are beneficial for big government and harmful for freedom, whether it's a war or an economic crisis or a pandemic. Our side tends to do poorly in those scenarios. And so, I don't want to be so cynical as to say that some people would welcome a sovereign debt financial crisis in the United States, but if it gets to that point, I think that people who believe in limited government are going to be in for a pretty tough time.
Yeah, better do it now than wait till it's too late. Phil Kerpen, AmericanCommitment.org. Read the piece, More Debt Without Spending Reform is Dirty. It's a great piece. Phil, thank you so much for your time this weekend on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And don't forget, you can find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org, Tuesday morning group coalitions and such. Until next weekend, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so long, and thanks for all the fish.